Pretty much as long as there's been movies, people have been interested in adapting authors to the screen, but some book adaptations are just better than others.
What I love about books on film is it doesn't necessarily need to be a traditional book. We have graphic novels, we have comic books, we have all kinds of poems even that have been translated to film. We have something that we've been forced to use our own imagination with, and then we get treated to the visuals later.
While Jane Austen adaptations have existed since the start of cinema, it really took a very specific point in 1995 for her to become the kind of cinema icon we know. You saw Emma Thompson adapting Sense and Sensibility, Amy Heckerling adapting Emma into Clueless. There was something that women writers were connecting to that audiences understood.
You get characters that are naive about how they operate in the world and what privileges that they have. But that doesn't actually mean that their problems are so small as to be inconsequential. There is grief, there is loss, there is betrayal throughout all of her novels.
If I had to choose my favorite Jane Austen adaptation, it's definitely Emma Thompson's take on Sense and Sensibility with Ang Lee directing. I think the two of them find this wonderful balance between the comedy and the romance, and it just hasn't really been topped.
When you watch Sense and Sensibility, you just sort of watch all this English propriety and this way of being in the world. There's all these social rules and all these social laws that you cannot break, because if you do, then you're outcast.
The moment that I think is the most memorable and relevant is where Edward confesses that he's available to Eleanor, and Eleanor breaks down and cries.
I'm not married.
No.
She starts crying, and then I start crying, and I can't get over it. Like, every single time, I'm like, are they gonna have their happy ending or not? Like, I get really emotionally invested. The same thing happens for me whenever I watch Clueless. I love Clueless, and I know that I'm a grown woman, and I probably should have gotten over my love of Clueless forever ago, but it's never happened, and it probably never will. It's a film about friendship. It's about self-actualization and discovery. It's about not judging people based on how they first appear. It wasn't until afterwards that I learned that Clueless was based off of Emma by Jane Austen, which, again, I just think is so ingenious. It's a part of what makes her stories so classic and so timeless, is that we can keep telling them over and over again, and each new generation discovers Austen, discovers her stories, discovers the women in her stories.
James Baldwin is probably one of the most quoted writers in America, especially when it comes to issues about race and sexuality.
The way in which he critiqued America, I think, still stands today in light of Black Lives Matter and Indigenous uprisings and all the ways we talk about Blackness in America and in Canada, to be honest. And so I think that he's one of the greatest thinkers of our time.
Figures like that, James Baldwin, Malcolm X, you want to paint them out to be these kind of rebellious uprisers. You want to paint them out to be angry black men. But the thing is, it's like there's so much love in their voice. And I think if you look at a movie like If Beale Street Could Talk, this is a movie that absolutely does justice to the love that James Baldwin has for his characters, the love that James Baldwin has for Harlem, for the Harlem community.
If Beale Street Could Talk is based off of the notion of young love. You've got this couple, Trish and Fonnie, who essentially want to start a life together. They want to get married, and Fonnie ends up going to jail for a crime that he did not commit. For Barry Jenkins' interpretation, when he shows the city, it is through the eyes of young love. As you're getting wrapped up in the story of them falling in love, he's also talking about them not being able to get housing because, especially in New York at that time, in the 60s, they didn't want to rent out houses to black men especially.
We go down there, and sure enough, when that cat sees me, he says, oh, there's been some great misunderstanding. I can't rent you the law because I got all this family coming in from Romania in like a half hour, and I gotta give it to them.
A lot of his writing can be seen in Raoul Peck's 2016 documentary, I Am Not Your Negro.
The story of the Negro in America is the story of America.
I'm Not Your Negro is a type of film that just lays out the facts, tells you who Baldwin is, what he stood for, what he believed, and then says, well, what are you going to do with it now?
All of his books are about the ways in which Black people can love ourselves and find freedom, however small or however large. I think If Beale Street Could Talk is really just another expression of that. It's about James Baldwin talking about family and talking about love and finding your way through in the world. And regardless of how you identify, who doesn't believe in those things? Who doesn't ask those questions? That's why he's so important, not just for Black people, but James Baldwin is important for everyone.
One of the reasons why Truman Capote's books were so popular but rarely got adapted to the screen was he used very edgy language. He often tackled subjects that were a bit taboo: sex, drugs, homosexuality, and I think that just couldn't be put on screen at the time. Strangely, the movie that Truman Capote is probably best known for is one of really the worst adaptations of his work, which is Breakfast at Tiffany's.
The film version of Breakfast at Tiffany's is directed by Blake Edwards, and it stars Audrey Hepburn in arguably her most iconic role as Holly Golightly. Probably the biggest difference between Truman Capote's story and Edwards' film is that Edwards' film is a romantic comedy, and in the original story, there is no romance between the two characters. It's really an asexual relationship.
The romance, I do think, is quite well done, but at the same time, it dulls her a little bit compared to the book. The film is a really good example of how people read movies and what they take from these stories, because when you think about Audrey Hepburn as Holly Golightly, what is remembered of the character and what becomes so iconic is everything outside of that. It's her assertion that she belongs to no one and no one belongs to her.
Holly?
I'm not Holly. I'm not Luna May either. I don't know who I am. I'm like Cat here. We're a couple of no-name slobs. We belong to nobody, and nobody belongs to us. We don't even belong to each other.
It's the image of her as this independent woman careening around Manhattan and going to Tiffany's, and it really is so different to where the film ends up, where she sort of submits herself to the romantic narrative unfolding.
I feel like there's probably not a lot of precedence for the kind of transition that Truman Capote made between Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood. It's really the first book that was labeled as a nonfiction novel. And the film that came out of it is also really remarkable in a lot of ways that I feel like it probably doesn't get adequate credit for. It's actually the photography in Cold Blood that really captures the spirit of the book, the feeling of the book. The photographer is the great Conrad Hall. And he does this thing where he pays this kind of special attention to objects that are closely associated with the killings. That's where I felt like I saw Capote's prose really brought to life, was just in the imagery.
I think Roald Dahl has actually one of the better track records when it comes to adaptations, and I think it's because he was so often very involved in them.
I think part of what is so special about his books is that they're fantastical. They take children into these worlds of fantasy, whether it is, going to a chocolate factory or going on an adventure in a giant peach with a bunch of bugs, or in the case of Matilda, which is my favorite of the adaptations, exploring this imaginary world of books.
I think the appeal of Roald Dahl is that he never condescended to children. There was always a real sense of danger in his stories. I mean, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory is literally like you're just watching kids bite it every couple pages. Like it's not something where there are guardrails for the children.
He's blocking all the chocolate.
Well, what happens now, eh?
Oh, the pressure will get him out. Terrific pressure is building up behind the blockage.
Well, I wonder how long it's going to take him to push through.
These are dangerous stories, and I think that's why children love it. I think it's why adults also have a great time with them as well.
Growing up, two of my favorite films were The Witches and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And from both those movies, the scenes that stick out the most are the most terrifying and traumatizing ones.
Your disgrace!
Not a lot of us really give the recognition and love to The Witches, which it truly does deserve. The movie does a good job of showing the selfish nature of adults That's an element that you see across all of Roald Dahl's books, this idea that adults aren't really the people that we, the children, can rely on to the extent that we should rely on.
Bret Easton Ellis was kind of the enfant terrible of the 80s and 90s literary world. He was a guy who wrote his first novel at 21 with less than zero, and he really captured in the zeitgeist a kind of excess and alienation that was being felt, especially in Los Angeles. Something Bret Easton Ellis offers as a literary figure to adapt is usually a great dark role for a male lead. Think Christian Bale in American Psycho, Robert Downey Jr. in Less Than Zero, or James Van Der Beek in The Rules of Attraction. These guys get to play really creepy, dark characters. It's really something to sink your teeth into.
Bret Easton Ellis is a difficult author to approach. His work is extremely graphic, it's repugnant, and it is intended to shock and offend. And reading the book, American Psycho, you are definitely getting into a realm that to translate it into a film, you are looking at a straight-up horror movie and possibly something that would be slapped with an X rating. Patrick Bateman is larger than life, played to comical excess by Christian Bale, who is clearly loving every minute of it. This is one of those roles that he was born to play, with that giant grin in the rain slicker as he explains the wonders of Huey Lewis and the News, and then takes Jared Leto out with an axe.
He's been compared to Elvis Costello, but I think Huey has a far more bitter, cynical sense of humor.
Hey, Albert,
yes, Alan?
Why are there copies of the styles section all over the place? Do you have a dog? A little chow or something?
No, Helen.
Is that a raincoat?
Yes, it is.
It's hilarious and disturbing, which is exactly what that story should be, to allow us to simultaneously dislike Patrick Bateman, but enjoy the movie enough that we're willing to sit through it. It's the perfect tonal shift.
No one chronicled the insanity and the excitement of the 1920s like F. Scott Fitzgerald. Unfortunately, for much of the 20th century, no director could really get Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby done right.
There's been a mixed bag of attempts to bring, specifically Gatsby to the screen. 1974, you have a great director like Jack Clayton. You have a screenplay by Francis Ford Coppola. You have the most charismatic movie star of the era in Robert Redford. You have a perfect Daisy in Mia Farrow, who has exactly the kind of pixie-ish allure that you would dream for that character. And yet, seemingly, everyone kind of just agreed on impact that the movie didn't work. And then Baz Luhrmann, a few years ago, tried to sort of Moulin Rougeify Great Gatsby by doing another one of his anachronistic period pieces where you have an old-timey texture, but then you have Jay-Z music.
Because the film is so extravagant and you have modern rap music and CGI parties, there's an artificiality that feels incompatible with the film's romantic impulses. And yet it also does fundamentally work as a film in the sense that it has this incredible story.
You want too much. I love you now, isn't that enough? I can't help what's past. I did love him once, but I loved you too.
You can add to The Great Gatsby, you can change it, and you can manipulate all of these things, but fundamentally, there still is a beauty to this narrative.
Something F. Scott Fitzgerald was known for was constructing his novels of a series of somewhat disconnected scenes. And that's why something like The Curious Case of Benjamin Button adapts so well.
The Curious Case of Benjamin Button has this absolutely absurd premise of a human who is born as an old man and throughout the course of his life gets younger instead of older.
How old are you?
7, but I look a lot older.
God bless you. He's 7.
It allows the movie to deliver these extremely relevant and poignant ideas about life and what really matters, and how we measure our satisfaction in life. And David Fincher and the screenwriters plucked this story and were able to create something that was heartwarming.
Graham Greene's novels and works are infinitely adaptable. I think out of the 26 novels he wrote, 19 of them have been adapted into various types of film. But the original ones that he collaborated on with Carol Reed as a screenwriter, for example, The Third Man, are the ones that really stick with us and the ones that are extremely memorable.
Like many other people his age, Graham Greene was involved in World War II. He was also involved in secret intelligence. And I think what he took away from that was a real fear of a certain kind of person. That person is very much typified in Harry Lime from The Third Man. It is a person who treats death and war very businesslike. A warmonger, but without emotion.
Graham Greene is one of those writers who's a little hard to pin down, but he always wrote about morality. He always wrote about making the right choice, doing the right thing, and how hard it can be to do that. There's a different sort of conflict going on in things like The Quiet American and The Third Man. Those are about duty. Those are about doing the right thing for Queen and Country, or King and Country, depending, and being horrified by the amorality of the people around you while doing your best to deny your own part in it. I mean, that's why The Third Man has that incredible speech from Orson Welles. He's just telling us we're all guilty, including the people sitting at home watching the movie.
Nobody thinks in terms of human beings. Governments don't. Why should we? They talk about the people and the proletariat. I talk about the suckers and the mugs. It's the same thing.
It's an incredibly witty, mysterious script. It has unbelievable acting, and it's just a visual masterpiece. Orson Welles at this point was a legend in cinema. He had already done Citizen Kane, and he's just got this beautiful grin, a mysterious grin that you know that there's more mystery ahead.
Patricia Highsmith is really the MVP of adapting books to film, and yet somehow she's not a household name. She's mostly remembered for her Tom Ripley series, and the Tom Ripley series has been adapted as early as the 1960s in Hollywood, in France, in Germany. There is a variety of Tom Ripley stories.
Purple Noon with Alain Delon's a really good early example. It has a kind of very sunny, languorous menace to it. Wim Wenders' The American Friend, which is all about Wenders' interest in American pulp culture, of which Highsmith is absolutely a part. And then a tremendously elegant, and I think, quite surpassingly beautiful adaptation like The Talented Mr. Ripley by Anthony Minghella. Matt Damon is one of the best cases of miscasting I've ever seen in a movie. It's very purposeful miscasting. He's not elegant and refined and sophisticated like Ripley is in the novel, but you can believe he aspires to be those things. Incredible performance by Jude Law as the person who he would like to become, and just a murderer's row of character actors. Anytime the two Phillips, you have Philip Seymour Hoffman and Philip Baker Hall in the same movie, you're in very good shape.
A great example of how Patricia Highsmith writes characters and how those characters are then adapted in the film is in Freddie Miles, Philip Seymour Hoffman's character in the movie. You can sense that from Tom's perspective in the movie, he hates him just as much as Tom in the book does, but he's such a wonderful presence that you just want to see him forever.
You live in Italy, you stay at Dickie's house, you eat Dickie's food, wear his clothes, and his father picks up the tab. If you get bored, you let me know, because I'll do it.
When it comes to Patricia Highsmith's novels and history, though, probably the most affecting book is her 1952 novel, The Price of Salt, which was written under the pseudonym Claire Morgan. At the time, this was a very edgy lesbian novel, and it was edgy not because of the sexual content, but because it had a happy ending. Patricia Highsmith knew at the time homosexual fiction, even homosexual pornographic fiction, required essentially a comeuppance to not be declared pornography. It could have as much sex as you wanted, it just had to have the characters die, kill themselves, something horrible happened to them, they turned straight at the end. So she wrote The Price of Salt and gave it a happy ending, which was so revolutionary. Patricia Highsmith eventually claimed the novel. She said it was by her. She renamed it Carol, which is such a lovely note to name it after the object of desire in the novel.
Todd Haynes' adaptation of Highsmith's book is really going against the genre of tragiqueer, these Hollywood book adaptations that really focus on these tragedies in queer lives. And for me, Carol is one of my favorite book adaptations.
Kazuo Ishiguro is a Nobel Prize-winning author, and really only 2 of his novels have been adapted for film. They're very lyrical, they're very flowy, and that usually doesn't translate particularly well to film, with the exception of the perfect, flawless Remains of the Day. Now, the novel really is all in the first person and the point of view of Stevens, who is played by Anthony Hopkins. This is offset by this incredible performance by Emma Thompson, who is passionate and vibrant. And so you have her fire and his stoicism come together as she tries to just pull out any degree of feeling for him, and he just withdraws more and more.
Really, we're focused on kind of the day-to-day minutia of how this butler and the other household staff set the stage for these more important people to make these huge decisions about the country and how their lives will unfold, and whether they will go into war or not. And Stevens, watches his life go by while he's in service to be kind of this perfect butler, but is not able to take any of that for himself.
The final moment of the film is shocking in that it just appears to be 2 people saying goodbye to each other. But what you end up seeing is 2 people who have accepted the choices they've made. I'm gonna cry. 2 people who have accepted the choices they've made in life. And even though the choices they have made have been the wrong ones, they are still going to continue on that path, even though they had a moment to correct it and get back on the right one.
It was so nice to see you again.
It was a pleasure to see you again, Mrs. Benn. Goodbye. Take care.
You get Anthony Hopkins just say goodbye with a completely straight face.
Goodbye.
But you know inside his heart is breaking, and so our hearts break too.
P.D. James was a politician, she was a baroness, and she was a best-selling author of mysteries and thrillers. James's The Children of Men is a cornerstone of dystopian science fiction. She was really looking at environmental destruction and the dissolution of religious significance. But when it came time to adapt this phenomenal book to film, Alfonso Cuarón picked a different subject. For Cuarón, he really focuses on the migrant and the refugee crisis as one of the central plot points.
Children are not born, nobody can have kids, and then one woman finally has a baby, and everyone looks at this figure as this kind of second coming, as the Messiah is coming. And Cuarón, while he leaves that element in his movie, he definitely wants to downplay that, because Children of Men didn't want you to have this foolish belief that religion was going to save you. It's the people. His movie is about, society coming together and rallying together to get something done.
In the book, it's Theo's wife who is the first woman to have a pregnancy in 20 years. But Cuarón updates it and makes it a young African refugee named Key. It's a huge difference because Cuarón's film then is much more about refugees. It's much more about the origin of life in Africa than it is about a marriage.
The scene from Children of Men that sticks with me is the long take car chase scene. It's unexpected and devastating. How he's able to sort of maneuver getting everyone's perspective in this moment of chaos, insanity, and the long take, the hold. It's an incredible sequence.
Stephen King is worth the hype. Like, when we say that he is the king of modern literary horror, we are not joking. We're not just making a play on words with his last name.
He's just a fan. Like, he's constantly watching horror movies, and I think that's why he's so outspoken about adaptations of his own material. And that's, I think, also why he's so enthusiastic of, encouraging people to adapt his material, because he loves movies.
There are so many Stephen King adaptations, but I think for me, while there are, sure, maybe better movies that came out of them, the best adaptation, hands down, is Brian De Palma's Carrie. I think that the film really understands something fundamental about this story. For all of the horror of it, for all of the gore that was actually quite terrifying to read, you see such a hope to Carrie that really makes this story so heartbreaking. She has these desires to just sort of connect with someone, and it becomes completely overtaken by both her mother and also her own abilities.
That's Satan's power. It has nothing to do with Satan, Mama. It's me. Me. If I concentrate hard enough, I can move things.
The great thing about Stephen King is that he is a writer that's known for horror, but he does have a pretty wide range. He has short stories that are just dramas. He has that coming-of-age story, Stand By Me, which is the one that I think a lot of us grew up with and that we remember most.
I think it gets labeled by a lot of people as kind of the non-Stephen King adaptation, mostly just because it doesn't go anywhere supernatural. It doesn't go anywhere traditionally horrific. But I think what's really interesting about it is that it still feels like him.
There's nothing gory, there's nothing physically haunting. It's the mental anguish and the mental fear of sort of, you know, not living up to something that's like not even attainable. And there's something that is really authentic about that kind of fear.
H.P. Lovecraft is the father of what is called in horror circles weird fiction. Essentially, ideas of people obsessed with things beyond understanding, beyond knowledge, basically strange, unknowable monsters taking over. Obviously, the Cthulhu mythos is huge. Everybody loves that kind of stuff, and he came up with just about all of it.
I think if you're going to discuss H.P. Lovecraft in cinema, you have to acknowledge that there has yet to be a truly successful adaptation of any of his books. I love Reanimator and From Beyond. I'm saying that right off the top. Stuart Gordon is a genius. But they're not the books. They're updates and reconfigurings and adaptations. And I think that's the only way you could make a Lovecraftian movie, because all the books are about people who glimpse something that drives them insane, and we can't see the thing they glimpse because we would also go insane. So what you see instead is Lovecraft's influence permeating all of these other horror films. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness sort of imagines what would it be like if H.P. Lovecraft was working now and had the following of a Stephen King. Well, he'd end the world, because that's his thing.
The better ones tend to be the ones that have the least to do with it. Like, I mean, I swear by Stuart Gordon's Reanimator, it's an incredible horror comedy, but it's not really quite the material. I think Color Out of Space is one of the more successful contemporary adaptations, but it's also sort of doing its own thing and kind of has its own identity to it.
You get Nicolas Cage in all his glory when he slowly loses his mind. When Nicolas Cage is being interviewed by a local news team, he looks really disheveled and he starts telling his family, like, look at my face, I look terrible.
Oh my God, couldn't somebody have given me a comb? Jesus.
With Arkham resident Nathan Gardner, who claims that an unidentified flying object landed in his front
UFO
yard
witness?
last night.
You said UFO. I didn't say UFO.
It kind of lets you relax just before all the horrible stuff starts to happen. So you let your guard down with that scene.
Another reason why people commit to more loose adaptations of H.P. Lovecraft's work is, unfortunately, he was a violent racist, considered racist even in his own time. So even by the 70s and 80s, you see people adding a lot more women characters, a lot more black characters, and kind of reclaiming what is good in these stories while leaving a lot of H.P. Lovecraft's bad personality out of it.
Toni Morrison's 1987 book, Beloved, was actually inspired by a real person. Her name was Margaret Garner, and she was an enslaved woman who escaped, and she escaped with her children.
When they caught her, or right before they caught her, she had slit the throat of one of her children because she would rather her child be dead than be a slave. And that is the horrific choice that Margaret Garner made. And Toni Morrison really kind of built a story around that.
It's raw. Like, you know it's wrong, but you also understand it. And that's what makes the film so complex. Like, there's There's no clear-cut villain outside of slavery itself.
The adaptation in 1998 by Jonathan Demme follows the book quite well, and I think it's really difficult to translate this very dense book into a film, but they did a really good job.
The story of Sethe in Beloved is Sethe growing up and being this woman and having her children and trying to make a living as this freed Black woman, but she's haunted by the past.
You know, Demme is a white male filmmaker making a very Black story, a Black story written by a Black woman, a Black story that deals in trauma. But I think you need to make a distinction between Demme and all the other white filmmakers that wanted to tell Black stories, because so many of those other filmmakers, they want to harp on that trauma. They want to harp on that trauma. They want to introduce a white character to situate themselves. Demme doesn't do that. Demme wants to focus on the love and the joy and the warmth. And Demme doesn't need to introduce white characters to help find his bearings. Demme lets you live in this world with this family, whether it's through the trauma or whether it's through the warmth.
Solomon Northup is an interesting individual. His book, 12 Years a Slave, makes it clear from the very beginning. He's just writing about his account of slavery and leaves it to the reader to decide whether fiction or truth is more terrifying. One of the things that makes both the film and the novel interesting, at least to me, is in Northup's mind, things will get better. We'll just get through it, because he still has that North mentality of, well, someone's gonna help us, not realizing the depth of what he's really in.
We need a sympathetic ear, an opportunity to explain our situation.
Who, in your estimation, is that sympathetic ear?
The two men I journeyed with. I'm certain they're making inquiries at this very moment.
I'll be just as certain they're counting the money paid for delivering you to this place.
They were not kidnappers, they were artists.
Over the course of the novel and over the course of the film, you slowly see him understanding that things are far worse than he ever imagined.
12 Years a Slave works so well as a film, partially because it has a Black director in Steve McQueen. He really understands the significance of the story. And I think also in a modern context, it's important to remind people that there was this time where slavery was kind of thought of quite differently. And the thought that a man's freedom is so on the edge is such a disturbing thought in the modern era and not that far away.
It is tough to watch, but it's such an essential work, and it really makes you think about America and its history, its legacy, and where it may go if things don't change.
Michael Ondaatje is one of Canada's most praised authors, but interestingly, he really only has one big film adaptation to his name.
The English Patient is the only Ondaatje you'll find if you go looking. And maybe that's as it should be, because the best thing about what Anthony Minghella does with the adaptation is leave out huge swaths of the book. Basically, it's an argument that Ondaatje's work is unfilmable in conventional terms, and all you can do is capture the spirit, which Minghella does really elegantly.
It's a grand film, and it's a grand love story. I remember watching The English Patient and crying. I mean, like, I bawled. I was like, no one's ever gonna love me like that. Like, it just felt like this beautiful love story. And you're going back in time, right? And so when you're watching The English Patient, it's really a film and a story about memory and about loss and about love. It's about all those things.
So promise me you'll come back for me.
I promise. I'll come back for you. The beauty of the film is that it captures the vibrancy of Ondaatje's prose, the sense of regret that suffuses the book. You can see The English Patient without ever reading the book and think it is a grand romance, and, you know, millions of people did. But if you've read the book, then you know that the film has captured it. It's all there. And I still don't know how Minghella did it. I interviewed him a couple of times and we talked about it. And I don't think he knew either. He just said he loved the book so much that that's what came out. And I believe him.
Mario Puzo was born in New York City, of Italian descent, which shouldn't be surprising given what he wrote about and certainly his most famous novel, The Godfather.
The Godfather is a really interesting analog with Jaws in the 1970s, in that there are these big studio movies based on these big blockbuster novels that everyone kind of understood weren't that great on a literary level, but the alchemy of Coppola's casting, his writing choices, and his skill as a director means that now we associate Mario Puzo with one of the great American films ever made. So much of the potency and the poetry of The Godfather owes to Francis Ford Coppola.
Godfather is one of the greatest cinematic achievements of all time. You know, it starts with that 30-minute wedding sequence that introduces you to every character, every drama, every interaction. Now, you understand out of this wedding that Sonny is the wild one. You understand that Michael Corleone does not want to be part of this family business. He's the reluctant heir to this throne. You understand that Don Corleone is a king. He's the majesty over a kingdom. It is all such beautiful cinema. It's such beautiful feeling cinema, and it's just efficient storytelling.
He really took what I think on the surface was sort of Pulp Fiction, and he made it, you know, a far richer and emotional and dramatic and cinematic experience. I think it's a good reminder that sometimes, you know, great works of literature don't make the best movies, but sometimes, you know, a really good piece of pulp and popular fiction can make a terrific movie.
Matthew Quick is a very interesting guy. He started off as a teacher, a special ed teacher, and he went on to work on his writing and his craft. When he wrote the Silver Linings Playbook, he really thought he was writing a book about a father and son and their relationship, and only when it became a hit and people started approaching him and saying he was so good at writing about depression, anxiety, and mental illness, did he realize that that was the strength of the book.
What's really interesting about the film version of Silver Linings Playbook is that the ensemble cast are all dealing with some sort of mental illness to varying degrees. So you have Pat's father, who's played by Robert De Niro, who is suffering from a gambling addiction and OCD.
That's OCD. That's crazy. What OCD?
You have Pat's best friend, who has this scene where he tells Pat that he is so overwhelmed that he feels like he's suffocating.
You okay?
I'm not okay. Don't tell anybody. Listen to me. I feel like I'm getting crushed. And crushed by what? Everything. The family, the baby, the job.
Something that connects a lot of Matthew Quick's characters is they are struggling, but they are stubbornly self-sufficient. They are characters who have it all together in a way that may border on self-harm. And that's why something like Silver Linings Playbook is fun, because you see these people who are trying to better themselves, but you realize the ways they are bettering themselves are harmful, and sometimes letting go is the best thing.
I think the importance of David O. Russell's adaptation is just the understanding that we're all going through something, that mental health really affects us all, just in varying levels and varying degrees. And if you can be your best self on the day, then it's a really good day.
Anne Rice's contribution to the horror literary world is tremendous in that she took these 18th century, really romantic, gothic vampires and situated them in the modern day. That was true of the books. It was also true of the movie. Obviously, Interview with a Vampire was a blockbuster smash success that really brought that romantic vampire into the public consciousness, and it captured a subculture.
Anne Rice really felt that Rutger Hauer from Blade Runner should play the character of Lestat, because that's who she was picturing. And to be honest, she was quite outraged when she found out that Tom Cruise had been cast. She felt that Tom Cruise was too big of an A-lister, and he had never played a villain up to this point. For me, Tom Cruise is the perfect Lestat. So much of the fun and the campiness of this film and the real thrill is seeing an actor like Tom Cruise, who had only ever really played these very straight heroes, be this evil and this malicious.
Tom Cruise is somebody that plays cocky, very callous young men who were sure of themselves, but kind of going through some type of crisis that they're going to just power through sheer force of charisma. And honestly, that's much of what Lestat does. And I think it really worked here. That kind of complete self-absorption that he radiates was very perfect for the part, and pitch perfect against Brad Pitt and how he plays Louis with all this self-pity and remorse and pathos. And at the heart of all of those different relationships is Kirsten Dunst as Claudia. And Claudia is a woman, you know, she has the mind and emotions of a woman, but she's eternally trapped in a 7-year-old's body. And to portray that type of maturity and kind of world weariness as a very young actress must have been such a feat for Kirsten Dunst, and she carries it off beautifully.
Bram Stoker, the great granddaddy of vampire fiction. He took folklore and legend of vampires that was already in existence, and he combined it with Gothic tradition of storytelling, and the result is the bedrock for modern horror.
Dracula was first adapted in what is kind of an outlaw adaptation. He had nothing to do with it, made in 1922, directed by F.W. Murnau, called Nosferatu. Although its connections with Stoker were never stated blatantly, it is the story that Stoker tells in Dracula. By the early 1930s, sound had arrived, and that added a whole other dimension of atmosphere to horror movies, and rarely was it used to such effect as in Todd Browning's 1931 version of Dracula starring Bela Lugosi.
Listen to them, children of the night. What music they make.
You need the Draculas on screen that it almost feels like you're just turning the camera on them, cinema verite style. That they have that magnetism that just draws the audience's eye. Bela Lugosi played Dracula on stage for a long time before he starred in Todd Browning's adaptation. You can also make Draculas where it's just the whole motion picture around it is just odd and off-putting. For example, Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, where Gary Oldman is a stylized figure. Not necessarily the kind of magnetism you get out of a Bela Lugosi, but a different take on the character that could work or could completely not be your cup of tea.
One of the things that makes this a really authentic adaptation of Bram Stoker is that Coppola returns the story device that Stoker originally used in his novel, and that is the act of letter writing. We actually get the letters read in the voices of the characters. You see that act, you see the penmanship. It really gives an authenticity to the film.
J.R.R. Tolkien is considered the modern father of fantasy, and that's kind of not true, but what he did invent was what we call high fantasy. Fantasy, you know, with maps and languages and very deep world building.
When it comes to adaptation, there's a lot of challenges with Tolkien's work. Pretty much every fantasy movie before Lord of the Rings was just cinema trying to get to a point where they could make Lord of the Rings. And then, you know, years later, Peter Jackson comes, and he was somehow able to convince studios to let him not shoot just one movie, but 3 movies at the same time in New Zealand for hundreds of millions of dollars. It's truly remarkable that the Lord of the Rings films even happened. They're absolute miracles as a result.
I'd say it's one of the few franchises where you release an extended edition that makes it even longer, and I'm like, yes, I'm there. You know, 4 hours, I am there. I don't care how long this is, because the world is just so vibrant and just so rich.
What Peter Jackson's films do so well is they give you those hints that you can get involved in the drama that's happening, the fight scenes, the special effects, but you also know that there's an entire world around everything that's happening. And that's why the Lord of the Rings, like Star Wars, have become for a lot of people this comfortable thing. A trilogy of movies you watch every year because it's like going back home and visiting old friends.
It's kind of the anti-superhero movie. The hero is the weakest character in the whole trilogy. Frodo is small, he's really inexperienced with the world, he has no magical powers, but in spite of all of this, Frodo has his friends, he has his loyalty, he has his devotion, and that's the enduring message of Tolkien's work, that even the smallest creatures on Earth could have an impact on the way the world functions.
John Updike is one of only 4 authors to ever win a Pulitzer Prize for fiction more than once. He was one of the most widely read authors of the 1970s and the 1980s, and many of his stories focused on white male protagonists. So when he wrote the book, The Witches of Eastwick in 1984, it was quite a radical departure.
They are actually witches with the whole like hocus pocus magic and everything, but they are visited by this man named Daryl Van Horn, who charms his way into their parents, every single one of them, and ultimately causes a lot of mayhem and scandal in the small town.
There's a scene that I think is done to comic perfection, and that is the devil, played by Jack Nicholson, in a church giving his famous monologue on women.
Do you think God knew what he was doing when he created woman? Huh? No shit. I really want to know. Or do you think it was just another one of his minor mistakes, like tidal waves, earthquakes, floods?
If there's anyone who should have ever played the devil in the history of cinema, it had to be Jack Nicholson. You know, he just oozes the debauchery and schmooziness of the devil in like the modern form.
Jane, last we meet, Daryl Van Horn.
That's the character that the movie really just like emphasizes to a very entertaining and comical degree, which is why it's such a fun movie to watch.
French author Jules Verne is one of the most translated authors in history, with his novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Around the World in 80 Days, and Journey to the Center of the Earth being just a few of the ones we've seen come on screen. Because Verne was so popular when cinema was invented, you see a lot of filmmakers immediately turn to Verne's work. His visions were realized by people like Georges Méliès in these beautiful silent versions.
Georges Méliès' masterwork is 1902's A Trip to the Moon, and this is really looking at Jules Verne's 1865 story From the Earth to the Moon and adapting it. If you look at the figure of the moon in A Trip to the Moon, it's really a creation of Jules Verne. The rocket ship sticking out of it, its personification. This is the kind of tongue-in-cheek nature that Jules Verne really loved. The first science fiction feature-length film was an adaptation of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and it was released in 1916. It's one of the most extensive uses of special effects in a feature film up until that point.
He's always questioning the possibilities of man. And I think that's one of the things that has made him such a endearing figure, is that you don't just think of, well, can people breathe on the moon? You think, well, how do they get to the moon? You know, how do people go under the sea? The idea of a submarine when he was writing it is completely different to what we now have, but we probably wouldn't have that stuff without his writings, right? So he was always ahead of the time.
Jules Verne films really returned to popularity in the 1960s and 70s, I think especially around the space race. That idea of exploration and adventure really tickled people's minds, and they made these epic movies like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
I remember watching this as a kid and being so taken by the moments where you get to walk underwater with these people in these almost current modern astronautian suits and how they're creating this entire life just under the water. But there's places of influence that Jules Verne has that we don't even think of today. And I would like to point people towards Back to the Future Part 3, because the whole reason why Doc Brown does what he does is because he was inspired as a child by Jules Verne. And this sense of exploration, this sense of excitement, he even names his kids Jules and Verne, which of course is how he connects with the Mary Steenburgen character, who is also in love with the idea of space exploration and the possibilities of humanity, and the idea that this fiction could possibly one day become reality.
H.G. Wells wasn't the first science fiction author. That was definitely Jules Verne. But H.G. Wells was the one who had the best concepts. He came up with ideas that were incredibly relatable. If you were just a regular person, you would be worrying about Martians invading and you being unable to defend yourself. You would be worried about being stalked by a madman you couldn't see. You would be fascinated by the idea of time travel, but horrified by the idea of someone traveling at you. There have been version upon version upon version of the Time Machine and War of the Worlds and The Invisible Man, but the way that people keep reinterpreting them for new generations, for new centuries, is remarkable.
The Invisible Man is just a fun movie, just a great, like, quick horror movie with a lot of humor in it. And Claude Rains is, of course, so wonderful.
I'm afraid I need this bicycle.
One of Wells's books that seems like it will stand the test of time is The War of the Worlds, partially because it's just such a great idea that you can place any sort of metaphor on, whether it's, Orson Welles doing it on the radio and freaking everyone out, or Steven Spielberg making his version that comments a lot on 9/11. It just seems like a very adaptable idea to different settings and different concepts.
The War of the Worlds, as directed by Byron Haskin, was incredibly advanced in its special effects. It used stop-motion animation to really bring the Martians and their technology to life, and it terrified audiences in 1953.
The original version is not bad, but it's also, you never feel it. The War of the Worlds is purely abstract. You're watching a scientist and a lady figure out what's going on. The Spielberg version puts you right smack in the middle of it and gives you absolutely no hope of escape. Steven Spielberg turned War of the Worlds into a 9/11 analogy that actually works and lets you feel the terror of an ordinary American whose world just collapses around him on one day, and all he can do is try to save himself and his family. It's Tom Cruise, he's not ordinary, but, for all intents and purposes. But Welles is always on the side of the people who have no fight, who are running away from the monster rather than facing it head on. And in the end, they have to find their courage and battle back. But, it's up to us to save ourselves. That's his message.
Like a lot of revolutionary leaders, Malcolm X wrote his autobiography partially because he knew that he may be killed. He knew that it was important to get his perspectives down to live beyond his own life. A lot of Black critics and creators rightfully wanted a Black director to tackle the film. In the end, the rights eventually went to Norman Jewison, but he was smart enough that when criticized, he stepped aside and produced the film and made sure that Spike Lee got to do it.
Spike Lee's personal kind of auteur vision came through very, very strongly, and you can see it in the way that he shot the film and the stylistic flourishes. When you are a Black American and you're learning about civil rights and you're learning about that struggle, reading the autobiography of Malcolm X and then being able to watch the film adaptation by one of the most prominent Black filmmakers of his generation is a real gift.
He casts Denzel Washington. I think Washington's performance is the most successful aspect of the movie. He doesn't necessarily create a flawless portrait of this character, but you get a sense of an incredibly charismatic speaker and thinker in formation.
When it comes to the scene where we see Malcolm X be assassinated, Spike Lee had to make a lot of interesting choices because who assassinated Malcolm X is not definitive. We don't necessarily know who did it. And so based on eyewitnesses and kind of testimonies of what happened that day, he reconstructed the scene and chose to foreground some aspects of it.
Brother, please, hold.
But the kind of weight of what was lost and the balance that was lost was really powerful. And we get a sense of what type of the discourse kind of left with Malcolm.
Tetsuya Yoshida is probably responsible for the West discovering the manga scene and Japanese anime. The whole manga industry, it's kind of incredible just how much art they produced and how cinematic it was and how those images and visuals from Yoshida's mangas have informed so much of cinema worldwide. Speed Racer really originated from a passion and affinity he had for Elvis Presley movies, specifically Viva Las Vegas, and also James Bond movies and the kind of gadgets in James Bond cars. So it's really this mix of pop culture that then became the show Speed Racer and really introduced to audiences, but also the industry, a whole new model and look and aesthetic for animation that would result in, I think, one of the great comic book and manga adaptations of all time, which is the Wachowski Speed Racer.
It's one of the first movies to have the all-digital sets. So when you're watching it, there is this like candy-colored, speedy, fast surreality to it that can be hard to anchor into if you've never seen it before, but makes complete sense if you are making a movie about a cartoon.
When Speed Racer was adapted by the Wachowski siblings into feature-length form, what they really narrowed in on was a storytelling style that would be representative not only of manga, but also of Speed, that you were telling the story in a way that had never really been done before, to get a feeling, some would say a little bit overwhelming, of racing, of being there, sitting in the cockpit. And it goes all the way back to the original manga of creating this sensation that is very difficult, but if you're willing to shatter all the rules, you can do.
Stefan Zweig was one of the most widely read authors during the 1920s and 1930s. He wrote biographies on Charles Dickens, on Balzac, on Dostoevsky, on Mary Stuart, and most importantly, on Marie Antoinette. In 1938, this biography was adapted to film with Canadian-born Norma Shearer playing Marie Antoinette. And it's that subtitle that Zweig comes up with, Portrait of an Average Woman, that really informs how we look at Marie Antoinette on film.
Another thing about Stefan Zweig's literature is it captures a very specific moment in time. If you look at a film like Max Ophuls' Letter from an Unknown Woman, you are seeing a movie that is shot after World War II, set in early 20th century Vienna. What it gets is that idea that Zweig really longed for that era and knew it was just over.
While Wes Anderson's film, The Grand Budapest Hotel, isn't a direct adaptation of a Stefan Zweig novel, it is nonetheless Zweig on film.
Wes Anderson talks about what drew him to Stefan Zweig as the symphonic passions he found in average people. Zweig really loved his characters to just have these wonderful inner lives, no matter their station in life. And that's why something like The Grand Budapest Hotel, focusing on bellboys and hotel workers, just pops so well. Stefan Zweig was also known for his very specific and florid language. And while that's not all over the Grand Budapest Hotel, you really see it in how Monsieur Gustave talks. That kind of magic language he uses is pure Zweig.
What happened, my dear Zero, is I beat the living shit out of a sniveling little runt called Pinky Bandinsky, who had the gall to question my virility. Because if there's one thing we've learned from Penny Dreadfuls, it's that when you find yourself in a place like this, you must never be a candy ass. You've got to prove yourself from day one. You've got to win their respect.
I think The Grand Budapest Hotel really proves that books on film are everywhere. Even when it's not a direct adaptation, what director, producer, or screenwriter isn't influenced by the books that they were raised on, by the books that they're currently reading when they're making a film? Books are where we always turn to for comfort, and I think even though some are not direct adaptations like The Grand Budapest Hotel, they are nonetheless books on film.